So I told you we were going to talk about Freud. Here we are. Freud gives us this idea that consciousness is something we need to understand. There's levels of consciousness. Now we know that we sleep, we have this engaged level of consciousness, and then we go into our sleep patterns. We haven't talked much about sleep. You have a chapter you'll get to read about sleep and how it affects consciousness. But Freud introduced this idea that a lot of how we understand the world is actually in our unconscious. It's down below. We don't have access to it until it kind of slips out. Freud called those Freudian slips because he was that aware of himself, he wanted his name on it. I don't really think that's how it happened, but he has these Freudian slips. So if you've seen that picture that has the iceberg, you might see there are some aspects below it. He called those the id, the ego, and the superego. And these are the three parts of the personality that Freud introduced that helped us understand from his perspective how individuals operate in the world. So when you think about the id, the ego, and the superego, the id is that more primitive side. It's what we would see in a small infant. Gimme now. I have no ability to wait for it. This is mine. Kind of like the seagulls in that movie. So that idea that there's no deferment for later or consideration of anyone else. It's about the me. This is a very prominent component that drives individuals according to Freud. Now there's other aspects, and the next one he actually saw as a developmental component was the superego. And the superego is the parent, or this is the right way we do things. And if you think about how children develop, they are gimme, and then they get parented into, we have rules about how this works. And so the superego is embodying that, how do we do things that follows the rules. It's much more what Freud would have called a Victorian way of behaving. And one of the things we understand from theorists is that they were captured by their culture, and he was absolutely rooted in Victorian culture. And in Victorian culture, we had a lot of right behavior, but underneath the surface was a lot of gimme, mine. And that's what he saw being operated out in the lives of individuals. Now, there was a next aspect that developed in individuals, and he saw this as the ego. And the ego is the intermediary, I think I said that right, intermediary between the id and the superego, because you can't just live in superego land and you can't just live in id land. So let's find a middle ground on how we can present ourselves, accommodating a little bit of each and still manage to make it through the day. That's how he saw those three parts of the personality work together, and they then show up in an individual. But it's all based on this idea that there's a drive behind to get what an individual wants or decides they need. One of the things Freud did introduce that has remained solid in our understanding, his daughter, Anna Freud, developed a little bit more fully. And so we have not just some of the more negative sides of these, but some more adaptive sides are what we call defense mechanisms. These have also been introduced into regular culture, so you may have heard these terms. And the idea that someone's in denial, this would be that stuff coming up from the unconscious that Freud would say they're in denial. They're not acknowledging that this is what they want. So that Freudian slip I want that. And that leaked out like, oh, I didn't say that. I would never. Those kinds of denials about those parts of ourselves. There are some others. Projection is one. You don't see it in yourself, but the idea that you can see those issues in other people, and that's that I'm in denial of my stuff, but boy, can I spot those problems in another person. Scripture actually talks about that, like get the log out of your own eye before you go after the speck in another person's eye. So this is part of what was being operated on in his life, and he saw this going on in others. There's a number of other aspects to different terms that you would see in defense mechanisms like repression, putting it back down so we can deal with it later, and others. Actually, humor was one of the ones that Anna Freud offered and added, that it's an adaptive defense mechanism so that we can delay dealing with those unconscious issues at a time that's maybe more appropriate. So defense mechanisms aren't considered bad until they get in the way of functioning. Defense mechanisms are just the tools we use so we can operate without the anxiety of what's coming up taking over. And that's where there can be productive ones or non-productive ones. In terms of development, Freud, we already talked about in the lifespan development that there was that oral stage, and you'll recognize as you go through your reading that there are components related to that. Again, the emerging from below, that unconscious area, and that's going to show up in all those stages: the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency stage, and then the genital stage. The all in all behind that, from Freud's perspective, was learning how to manage drives that are in the unconscious as they start merging forward and pushing their way into the more conscious aspects of life. Now, the Neo-Freudians came along and they thought that Freud really emphasized sex way too much, that there was more to life than just this sex component that he saw being so prominent. And part of what they were responding to was they weren't as saturated in a Victorian frame of mind as he was. They were a little further down the timeline, so they maybe have a little more perspective, and they weren't living in the same community. So there were some of those aspects. Alfred Adler is one of those, and Adler came along and his whole frame was much more positive, a little reactionary on his side, both to his own context and also to what he was reading from Freud. Adler thought that instead of this developmental component that Freud was proposing related to sex, he thought there was more of a focus on inferiority complex, and that there was this idea that people didn't feel like they were enough. And so he addresses ways on how individuals can understand themselves as someone who is enough, or some of the issues that are impairing them are about not being adequate or inferior. So he would look at that in terms of what are the tasks, what are the requirements that have to be achieved in order to have a sense of esteem in light of the expectations that an individual has in their lifetime, in their community. Additionally, along this time as a Neo-Freudian is Carl Jung. Make sure you understand how that's said. It's Jung. It doesn't spell that way, so Jung. Jung was an analytical psychologist, and he looked at this. There was definitely stuff that was a little more unconscious, more like archetypes. And he saw that there were cross-culturally these ideas of like the warrior, the savior, those kinds of components that we see in every culture, that we are actually part of this larger frame and we embody it. There's actually some aspects of Buddhism and Hinduism that you'll see woven into how Jung explored the personality. And part of that is because Jung did some traveling during his life as he was developing his theory. And in that, while he was raised in a definite Christian Protestant perspective, in his exploration throughout culture, he recognized that these archetypes were there and that these other religions may have something to help us understand. So it got woven in. In that, he also saw us having a persona, and we have both a dark side and a light side, kind of that yin and yang aspect to our personas. So we have the one that is going to be received well, and then the dark side that might be more needy or perceived as less acceptable in our communities. Other things that Carl Jung introduced were extroversion and introversion. Also, terms that are part of our culture now that we just assume everybody understands. There are lots of different ways of understanding these terminologies, but the way that Carl Jung introduced it is that introverts are going to be energized more by being alone, that they don't seek attention, that they're not needing that interaction to understand what they think. They stay on topic. They actually think about what they want to say before they say it. These are some of the ways that Freud conceptualized an introvert. And an extrovert, on the other end of things, according to Carl Jung, was energized by being with other people, speaks quickly, sometimes figures out what they're saying, and then figures out what they're thinking afterwards, and then does a lot of that engagement in this more active way. These were new terms, new ways of understanding. And we do have some personality tests that definitely impact, how we see that. If you've seen some of those, sometimes they'll have a spectrum of how extroverted or how introverted you are. And we see that actually developmentally, a lot of individuals will stay pretty consistent through life. If there is going to be movement, it's going to be moving more towards the middle ground. So they modify because life kind of requires that you don't get to be pretty extreme in that. We have times as we grow in life, in our roles, where we have to learn how to be adaptable. So that could explain some of the changes that might happen along that paradigm. Karen Horney is a female psychologist who added to this. Again, note how the spelling is not something always so easy. It's Karen Horney. And Karen agreed with Jung. She thought that individuals had this sense, it was kind of along the lines of Maslow, that we could actually become our very best self. As Karen Horney developed that, she introduced this idea that there was this unconscious anxiety we weren't aware of, that would actually compel us to move towards individuals or away from individuals, that it would cause us to work against individuals or actually support them. In all of those aspects, this was a new way of conceptualizing the interaction at a social level that was fueled from an unconscious component of anxiety. So we've had this psychoanalytic, the psychodynamic development is going on, and about this time, the behaviorists show up. So they are looking at personality from a very behavioral, what's seen component. And you remember Skinner. And Skinner comes along and he's like, we behave in certain ways that are reinforced. Remember classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So behaviors are reinforced by our environment, maybe by internal components that might be part of that, but it's all about learned behavior. That's how personality is developed, according to behaviorists. So the behavioral perspective actually was part of the fuel that brought Bandura onto the scene. And he saw this behavioral component. Yes, that's true. And it's tied to how we interact in our social situations, not just at a behavioral level, but at a relational and internal frame of that. So it's the social cognitive perspective of personality development. And he developed this social cognitive theory because that's what these people do, is they develop theories. And he emphasized that learning is not just about this reinforcement, but it can actually be a cognitive activity, not just that reinforcement part, but requiring even abstract thinking to conceptualize those components. Additionally, he's the one that introduced observational learning, the idea that we can learn who we want to be or aspects that we might want to explore. Remember, the role playing that happens from 3 to 5 frequently is about acting like another person, and you maybe play the dress up component, being someone that delivers the mail or drives the truck or cooks the food or makes the coffee. All of those can be things that then get role played into maybe even personality dynamics. And this is what Bandura introduced. The other concept that was core to him is this idea of self-efficacy, this idea that does an individual have an agency? Do they have the ability to choose for themselves? Which was a significant contrast to Skinner. Skinner didn't see that we as individuals had choice. We were just responding to our environment. We're just organisms. It's dictated out by these response pieces. But Bandura believed that we actually have some aspect of choice based on how we think about things. We get to choose a response. And I think that most of us would say that makes a lot more sense. I get to choose. Now, I don't always choose. Sometimes I just react, like Skinner said. The way that Bandura conceptualized this is that there's actually this interaction pattern or this reciprocal determination between our behaviors, the situational factors, and the cognitive factors. And this actually supported then the emerging into cognitive behavioral ways of understanding our world. And you'll see when we get to therapies how cognitive behavioral therapy is built very much on some of these concepts, that how we behave influences maybe what's going on in our environment, but it also is influenced by how we think about who we are in the environment, and these go back and forth. This is called reciprocal determinism. Another theorist that added to this is Julian Rotter, and that addition was about locus of control. These also might be terms that you've heard about and used outside of the science of psychology, but the idea that we have maybe motivations that are going to be more an internal locus of control or an external locus of control. So when we think about locus of control, it's which are the primary motivators for our behaviors, our actions, our ways of operating. And you'll see a number of individuals are going to operate on how can they manage in this environment to be who these individuals or this situation is dictating. Whereas other individuals that have more of an internal focus are not as worried about the environmental piece. It's more, what is it that I want to be? Who do I want to be in this moment? How do I interact in this situation to give the best to what this control center is saying I need to be? So those can be, individuals can have both, but there's usually a sense that one is more primary than the other. This led to a number of different research studies on understanding where the locus of control, what's helping with the judgment call. Walter Mischel put this into effect with a marshmallow study. And with small children, and again, we're talking about, do they have the developmental capacity to cognitively understand delayed gratification? And he gives them a marshmallow and they have to decide, are they going to eat that one or not eat that one for a length of time? And if they don't eat it, they get 2. But that means they have to hold out. We know that a lot of individuals don't like waiting. Now, if you watch this video and you see, you're like, but they didn't have to wait that long and they could have had 2. But that's a lot like studying in college, isn't it? Isn't that a lot about life? Can I do the hard work and not get instant gratification right now because I see something down the road that's worthwhile? And just because these small children can't get at that marshmallow, but they can sniff it and touch it, maybe take little nibbles out of it, that's what we have to learn how to do in life. How can we make good decisions about what gets us down the road, recognizing that working today on things that we don't get reward for today has value for something that might be 2 marshmallows worth down the road. So now we're to humanists. There was a lot of overlap with these, but we actually are kind of developmental. Humanists kind of showed up at the end of the 50s into the 1960s and then fully merged into our way of thinking about the world in the 1970s. And this isn't just in psychology, but primarily in psychology. You're going to see this from Abraham Maslow. Maslow felt like there was this whole hierarchy in how we could understand who individuals were and what they were seeking. He developed this concept that individuals could self-actualize. They had to have certain needs met, then they could move on to other needs. As they got to the point where most of their core needs were met, they could self-actualize and rise above all the needs and then be altruistic and give to others. Now, I don't mean to be sarcastic. Does it happen? Yes, I think individuals do get to the place where they can be altruistic. We have a number of examples of people who have been able to get enough of their needs met that they've been able to give back. But I think that there are challenges to how he presented this, and that's going to be true with all of these theorists. So there were risks. That's going to be true with all of these theorists. So recognize that his basic need model is very helpful for our understanding on how can we support individuals, but it's not the full explanation, just like Freud's theory wasn't the full explanation, nor is any other theory. Carl Rogers came along around the same time, and Rogers introduced this idea in terms of personality that we are actually working on this idea of the ideal self. Who is it I need to be? And with that, we're bringing in experiences of our interactions with the world where there's conditions of worth. Other individuals are helping us understand that if we would just be this ideal self, we would be loved and accepted, and we will, in some senses, have arrived or gotten to that actualization component. And so he thought that we absorb some of those, and the challenge was that the real self and the ideal self may not overlap or have that kind of interface, and that the ideal self and the real self are in this constant tension. He felt like that was part of the issue, that there's always this striving. He also developed a therapy that you're going to hear about when we get to that chapter in terms of providing a place where individuals could maybe work to see more of an overlap and understand that those expectations related to conditions of worth could be things that they could think through, adjust, and maybe come to more realistic options. Now we're to the biological components. And when we think about personality, certainly there are biological components that seem evident. And in fact, in the Minnesota study of twins reared apart, they've had a number of twins that were raised in separate living situations from birth. And they found when they evaluated them later on in life that they frequently have some overlapping, not 100%, but some overlapping traits, interests, ways of operating in the world. There is the support that we have for there to be some biologic genetic components that may play out into the expression of emotion. Additionally, related to some aspects of this are trait theorists. And so the names you want to associate with that are Gordon Allport. The names you want to associate with that are Gordon Allport and Raymond Cattell. And these are two individuals that felt like there were consistent traits that were going to be a part of an individual. Some of that idea that things might show up early on. I mentioned my son being someone who was able to and chose to tell truth, and he still is someone like that. There are other kinds of traits that would be maybe core to our personality or peripheral, but still present and consistent in terms of how they show up, but there are going to be more nuances to that. Raymond Cattell took the 4,500 traits that Gordon Allport put together, and he distilled it down into 171 traits. Much smaller, but still so many. But in that, he identified 16 different dimensions that help us understand how personality may play out. And you may have heard of the Minnesota multiphasic personality. Nope. And you may have heard of the Myers-Briggs. And that actually is built a lot on Raymond Cattell's theoretical information. Moving on, we have Eysenck. Hans and Sybil work together to give us this idea, developing that extroversion and introversion dimensions and helping us understand that there's more to it than that. There's high introversion and high extroversion that are going to fuel how engagement happens in the world. Along with that is this neuroticism and stability. Neuroticism would be maybe a worrying component. And in high neuroticism, there's like a significant anxiety that is just permeating interaction with life, whereas the stability is kind of emotionally stable, not really reactive to their environment. These, again, were new additions from the Eysencks. The most recent addition to understanding personalities is the 5-factor model. And in this, there is the big 5, or the 5 that we count, you can actually see under an acronym of OCEAN. So O is openness. So on that, you have a spectrum of low openness to experiences versus high openness to experience. In conscientiousness, low would be impulsive, not really thinking about the consequences of maybe actions, whereas high is more restrained. And in this, we're going to see that it's not one over the other as good. There's going to be pros and cons to where you might find an individual on that spectrum. The E in OCEAN is extroversion. So you've heard enough about that from these other theorists. It's going to be extroversion and introversion, kind of like reserved and quiet versus outgoing and maybe enjoying more boisterous energy. The A is agreeableness. Low agreeableness would be kind of a critical response. It's going to be that not really engaging and having more of a negative approach. High agreeableness is helpful, empathic, much more engaged in that supportive component. That takes us to N, and we're back to neuroticism. And much like we heard about prior, neuroticism is going to be about low neuroticism being calm, stable, not very reactive, and high neuroticism being anxious, reactive to environmental components. So there are different tests you can get on personality theories related to things like OCEAN or any of these other theories that can help you identify how an individual might operate. The questions related to that and what information is going to be helpful for that. And that lets us understand that we need to understand in the context of the individual, what's the information for and how does it fit within their sense of identity, maybe in their community, in their culture, in their region. What we do know is that social conventions are going to dictate certain behavior. So you're going to have certain communities, certain countries, certain cultures that are going to say this is right behavior, where an individual in that may be somebody who's outside the norm because they have a hard time being quiet and reserved, but they go to a community where being outgoing and boisterous, and that's the standard. Now they're not outside the norm. So recognize that as we think about personality, context is also dependent. So they may have traits that are going to have some tension in certain situations where they won't have tension in other situations. And that leads us on to what we do with assessments, what kind of assessments are available, how valid are they, and what do we do with them. You've probably taken a self-report inventory that told you, for example, what Disney princess you are, or what hero you are in the Avengers, or what character in Harry Potter. Any of those are going to be based on these kinds of components, but are they valid? No, they're not valid. Remember, valid is accurate, but we have to identify what is personality. And all of these theorists have defined it in some regards. So then it's also, are they reliable? If I take that Disney princess quiz, every time am I going to come up with the same answer? And maybe or maybe not, depending on what's going on for that individual. So what we see with self-report inventories, there's going to be characteristics or situations that may change, but that's how we do most personality tests. That's how we understand those things. Now, there are some values in terms of helping an individual understand how they may come across within another person, or understanding how there might be some tension that could be addressed in new ways. Self-reports can help with that. How effective are they in other situations? Usually not as overly effective as I think a number of organizations may want to give them weight to. It's really just one set of data that we can use for building plans for engagement in group activities or projects. But there are other tests that psychologists use. One in particular, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, it is a self-report. There are over 500 questions that are going to be true-false that an individual is going to fill out so that they can come up with answers that are based on their preferences. In that, it's been researched so extensively that we know it's valid. It comes up with good information for us to understand where different traits are showing up for this individual. And we know that it's reliable because individuals that take it over a period of time are going to have pretty consistent scores in their answers. Some of the things that you would find being assessed on the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, or MMPI, are hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviance, paranoia, traits like that. And these are going to be more related to psychiatric issues, or issues related to, is this person under significant distress? These are used significantly in individuals' situations where we might be looking at what is the best treatment for this individual and how can we shape a treatment plan that's effective based on the needs and issues that are showing up on this inventory. Other tests you might recognize associated with personality are what we call projective tests. There are a number of different projective tests. The Rorschach Inkblot test, you may have seen some of those ink blots. And this is actually based on some of the Freud and Neo-Freudian perspectives that we project our stuff onto this stimulus. And so in that, a person is asked what they see, and their responses over a period of time are going to give some of the themes that are issues for that individual. Is it valid? There's some question on validity. Is it reliable? Also not super strong. Is it useful? Not as its own data point. It's going to be used in the context of other interventions or understandings for assessment. Additionally, there's different components that might have pictures that you have somebody tell a story, and in their storytelling, they're going to give away some information about how they think about things, the roles of relationships, and maybe even how they see themselves in those components. These are called projective tests, where an individual is projecting their own preferences, their own ways of understanding the world onto a stimulus. So what's the value of assessing personality? Well, most of the stuff you're probably coming across is just for entertainment. In some cases, it could help you understand a little bit more about what you prefer and maybe who you are going to have an easier time getting along with. Is it going to be predictive for your future? Maybe, but I wouldn't take which princess you are, which Harry Potter character you are as definitive of who you're going to be for the rest of your life. You have a lot of say in that, and your life is still full and filled with all sorts of opportunities for the choices that you're going to make. When it comes to personality, you certainly have preferences. When it comes to personality tests, those are for specific purposes, usually in clinical settings. When it comes to interacting with others' personalities, recognize that we're all different, we're all unique, we're all valuable, and who we are is shaped by a lot of things, and it's all a gift. You are special, not so much a snowflake or a unicorn, but special because you're created in the image of God.